Hello to all my wonderful AP students. How are you doing? This is one of the last lectures of the year, which is crazy, but I hope you enjoy. This one's all about waste and how we reduce our waste so we can save the turtles. Okay, so I want to start with literally the coolest thing ever. So these are manta rays, and they're like pretty insanely cool in my opinion, right? Like, how could these crazy aliens get any cooler? Well, bam, pink manta ray. Literally, I think it's the coolest thing ever. Like, you have these crazy creatures, and then these people discovered a pink manta ray because it had mutations that made it friggin' pink. I think it's amazing. I'm also really tired, so maybe y'all are rolling your eyes at me. Whatever, I don't care. It's amazing. Alright, so let's get to learning. So solid waste is what we're going to talk about for most of this slide. Solid waste is any material that you're throwing away that's not a liquid or a gas. We make it at home, so that's domestic industries like factories and businesses like Amazon and agriculture like farms. We all make waste. It's part of being a human being at this point. So where is it disposed? Typically landfills, like this monstrous thing up here. But landfills aren't amazing, clearly. And if they aren't well designed, they can actually contaminate groundwater, which is not good, and then they can release harmful gases. So imagine how much pollution is sitting in this landfill here. It's not good. But ideally, we want to have these nice, clean, and sanitary landfills. So to do that, you need a couple things. You need a bottom liner to kind of line the whole thing, which is what you're seeing here. And that's usually made of plastic or clay. So think back to our soils unit, what we know about clay, why we would want to line a landfill with clay. You also have a stormwater collection system, which isn't pictured here, but it's just a form of allowing water to kind of filter through and be collected. There's also something called a leachate collection system, which is a leachate. So a leachate is any contaminated liquid that's passing through a landfill. So there is tons of liquids. It's not just solid as it decomposes and decays. Liquids are created and they kind of collect pollutants as they move through the landfill. So these leachate collection systems are designed to collect those liquids and sort of filter them out to be treated so that they don't get into our soil and into our trees and our beautiful nature. There is also a cap on a landfill so that when it's full, the cap will keep everything contained. And there's also a methane collection system. So remember that all things produce methane. Trash, as it builds up, releases a lot of methane, so there has to be a system in place to take the methane from the landfill and sort of treat it in its own way. So those are the major components for a good landfill. Even though it's ugly, it still needs to be well designed. So this is a little bit more of a detailed image of a landfill. So if you zoom in on the actual waste or the solid waste here, you have all this trash built up and it's kind of lined with a layer of soil, which is what you see here. And then the next layer is gravel and drainage for that stormwater that we were talking about, or just general water. There's also a plastic liner in this fancy landfill. And then there's that collection pipe for the leachates or the polluted liquids that pass through it. And then this orange strip is the clay that kind of lines the entire landfill and separates it from the soil and the rock beneath it. And again, you have those methane pipes that will kind of recover the methane from the landfill and they will take it to a factory. And I'm going to get into this more in a minute, but that methane can actually be used to generate electricity, which is kind of cool. And then again, the leachate pipes will take out those somewhat harmful chemicals or pollutants, and they will treat them in a tank to make sure that they don't get into our soil or our groundwater. So they're not all bad and ugly. There is some good news. So like I said, that methane can be collected, and then it can be used to generate, to turn a turbine, which will generate electricity. So it's a complicated process, but it goes from the landfill, the gas is collected, it's cleaned, and it's moved through a generator, and then it eventually ends up in our electric grid, which is kind of cool, and it also reduces the volume of waste in a landfill. Not by a lot, but still. So there's also other things we can do to kind of mitigate the bad and ugly parts of landfills. So that could be that we burn the waste for energy, which we've learned about before. Burning our trash can be a form of energy. And another positive that I think is awesome is that we can actually restore landfills to use them as parks, which will create habitats and more photosynthesis and more oxygen to kind of purify our air. So this is the Fresh Kills landfill back in 1973, and this is the current plan / the new plan for that area. It's turning into this beautiful park. And this is actually in Staten Island. I really hope I can take you guys there because it's super cool to see what they're doing. They're really committed to taking this once ugly landfill and turning it into something amazing and also educational. So it totally rocks, in my opinion. Again, Staten Island, go New York. Now let's talk about e-waste. So e-waste is just technology waste. Any electronic device, your phone, your computer, your TV, they don't get thrown away. Really, they can be reduced or recycled or reused. But they're hard to kind of just throw away because they contain tons of hazardous chemicals, including things like lead and mercury, which can end up in the groundwater if they're not disposed of properly. So we don't want these things kind of just building up in our landfills because they will start to poison our water and our land, which is not good. Sad face, right? So a way to try and combat the amount of e-waste we produce is to reuse electronics, and there are a lot of programs to take our old electronics and recycle them, which is challenging because there's so much e-waste already, but it's better than it just sitting in a landfill. If we can repurpose it, if we can just reduce the amount that we're making altogether, that will help to kind of slow down the amount of e-waste that we are producing and will produce as we become even more technological and robotic. Okay, so there are a lot of other ways to deal with solid waste that aren't landfills. So solid waste can be disposed of through incineration, where waste is burned at really high temperatures. And this doesn't really just look like an open flame. It's actually done in factories, and it has many systems in place, so it's not just open flames going crazy in a big field. But there still is air pollution from this. As you can see, it's not a clean process when you're burning our trash. But that is one available option to deal with waste, which we turn to often when we run out of room in landfills. So some things are also not allowed in landfills, and they need to be disposed of, so that's done illegally a lot of the times, which can cause massive problems for our environment. So one example you wouldn't really think of is rubber tires. And when they build up in these piles, they kind of become these hotspots for mosquitoes who love this kind of habitat. And we know that mosquitoes can spread disease like which disease? Zika, yay. Not yay, but hopefully you got that on your own. So some countries also dispose of their waste by dumping it in the ocean. And this has led to literally floating islands of trash in our oceans. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and it's literally a massive patch of garbage floating in the Pacific, and you can imagine the kind of damage it leads to in terms of wildlife and the amount of pollution it puts into our water. And just so you can kind of visualize it, this garbage patch is actually two massive garbage patches put together, and it's more than twice the size of Texas. It's massive. It floats right outside of my home state, pretty far off the coast, but it's huge. And it's mostly made out of plastic, actually, a lot of debris and microplastics from fishing and things like that. But this is a mostly plastic garbage patch, which is pretty scary in terms of what our future ocean will look like if this ever goes away, and how will our Pacific Ocean recover from the Great Pacific Garbage Patch that humans gifted it with. Sad and scary. Okay, so this is an extra credit that is a little random because I put it in the wrong order, but I want you to research what are some items that are banned from landfills. We learned about one substance that's very commonly banned from landfills, but you can use your brain, try and answer it on your own. You can do a little research on common items that are not allowed in landfills, so take a break if you need it to get that extra credit point. So now I'm going to talk about sewage, and sewage is not that fun of a topic, but sewage is our wastewater. It comes out of these pipes, hopefully not into our water, but it needs to be treated and cleaned so that we don't just have a world full of poopy water or wastewater. So there's kind of 3 steps of treatment for sewage water. The first is primary treatment, which is just removing large objects. Often, like, they use these screens and grates, which are like really fine screens. So they allow all the big stuff to kind of fall through the screens, and then it collects and settles into the solid waste at the bottom of a tank. Okay, and then the secondary treatment is where you have these biological processes where you add bacteria to a water solution and they break down the organic matters. That's what's happening in this process here. So they break all that stuff down into carbon dioxide in inorganic sludge, which is just like mud basically. And that settles at the bottom of a tank, and the tank is aerated, so kind of like fluffed around, to increase the amount of bacteria that break down the organic matter, or like how fast they go. So it's kind of cycled through so that the bacteria really clean out all the waste from the sludge. So it's like a highly filtered process where you have just like the raw sludge will get filtered out. The main like sewage stuff will go through these aeration tanks that have the bacteria. They'll actually get filtered again. More sludge is kind of made, and then it goes back through the filter before it leaves. Then you have tertiary treatment if necessary. All waste gets some sort of disinfectant, but if needed, all that water will leave. Tertiary treatment would be things like different chemicals being used to remove any extra pollutants that are left in the water after primary and secondary treatment. And like I said, excuse me, all water is treated with a couple of kinds of disinfectant, things like chlorine, even ozone, and UV lights to kill off the bacteria that were used to clean out the water. So a kind of complex and somewhat boring process, but this is how your cities stay clean. This is how your water stays clean. It doesn't come out brown in the shower. So this is kind of one of those things you don't want to think about or see, but you should be very grateful for. Alright, now we're going to talk about hazardous waste. Those are kinds of the things that can't go in landfills, but still need to be dealt with. So things like batteries, gasoline, and even nuclear waste like uranium. So there's a couple different steps for treatment. I'm not going to go as in depth about these ones as sewage, but biological, something called land farming, which is interesting, where microbes or little bacteria and things like that are used to kind of stabilize the waste. They'll break down parts of it that are super hazardous. They won't clean it perfectly, but they'll do their job. Chemical treatment, which can use chemical reactions to treat the waste. Again, not perfectly, but does something. And then thermal, you can burn this hazardous waste, much like solid waste. And physical treatment can be concentrating it and solidifying the waste by like encapsulating it into cement or something like that, or even trying to evaporate it. So I know that's a lot of information. Don't stress too much about it. I think the more interesting stuff is kind of how it's disposed of or stored, because hazardous waste stays hazardous for a long time. So it has to be put into secure landfills, which are a little different than regular. They have this cap that's impermeable, meaning nothing can go through it. It's kind of like being put into a little box, an airtight, sealed box that all the hazardous waste will sit in. So this could be something like uranium, which you're seeing here, gets buried and gets covered with something really, really thick and impermeable, meaning nothing can go through it. Another thing you can do is underground injection, which is where you pump waste into layers of rock at least half a mile below the surface. It's kind of crazy to think about that we're putting our waste back into our earth, but it is one of the solutions for our toxic or hazardous waste. So I put this picture in here too because I grew up in this area of California that has this power plant that was called the San Onofre power plant. It was super popular because it looks like 2 boobs, and people would always say, "I'm passing the boobs," which kind of meant like you're on your way home. So this power plant is no longer active, but there's this huge battle for how to deal with the nuclear waste from these power plants, because it still exists even though the power plant hasn't been active since like 2013. There's tons of waste still sitting there like this, and it needs somewhere to go. So people are battling to get it off of this beach, off of this beautiful California landscape, because they don't want it there. They need a safer place for it. People believe that earthquakes and things like erosion will threaten the safety of that nuclear waste. Science doesn't really 100% agree with that, but think it's a good argument that no one wants nuclear waste sitting on a beach. So people like protesters and citizens are working with the government to try and find a solution and a place to put the nuclear waste. So I think that's a little interesting bit about my hometown. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is how we can reduce the amount of waste, methods we can use to reduce the amount of stuff that goes into our landfills. And the best thing we can do is reduce, reuse, and recycle. Most of you know what recycling is. It's taking solid waste like paper, plastic, glass, and converting it into new products like recycled paper, like recycled plastic bottles. And I know that Nike and Adidas are both working on taking plastic and turning it into shoes, which is kind of cool. But the issue with recycling, while it seems good and kind of reduces the amount of stuff being made, it is still energy intensive to take old stuff and make it into new stuff, and it's very expensive, which is why large companies like Nike and Adidas can do it, but not everybody else can. So there are some drawbacks to recycling. Composting, on the other hand, which is my favorite thing to talk about, it's something that I do in the classroom, but you can also do on larger scales. But you basically just take organic stuff like fruits and vegetables, paper. I put tea bags in my composting bin. You can put other plants, things like that in there. You'll put it in this big pile or in my bin, and then over time the materials decompose or the worms eat them and produce this awesome fertilizer. So it can look like this in our classroom. It can also look like massive piles. You don't need worms for your composting to happen. It will happen on its own, and you get this awesome fertilizer. So the drawbacks to composting are that there's a smell, and I understand, but I think if you do it right, the smell's not super bad. I don't know about if it smells on this scale, but my bin has never smelled. You guys would complain if it did. Rodents is also a good point. I don't have to deal with that in our class, luckily, but I'm sure this would create some unwanted pests. But I think it's awesome. That's my opinion, not science, but I think composting is very underrated. And if we can do it in our classroom, what's the rest of the world doing? Alright, that's it. I'm so sorry this was so long. A lot of it was just me rambling. Again, I'm really tired. I'm sorry. You made it. Congrats. Bye.